At dinner in the restaurant, I accidentally noticed a pregnant woman with a familiar appearance. When I looked up at her face, my heart seemed to stop beating. The daughter-in-law that my son said had run away 8 months ago. She saw me and immediately ran away, but when I followed to ask for the truth, I received an answer I couldn't believe. That answer exposed the truth I had been blind to for the past 8 months. Before I reveal the truth that shattered my world, please hit like, subscribe, and comment, where are you watching from today? Wherever you are, please take care of your health. Note: this is a fictional story crafted to explore betrayal and survival. The message carries genuine significance. Now let's continue. The pen felt like a lead weight in my hand, and for a second, the $2.3 million contract on the table blurred into a smear of black ink and expensive paper. I, Mitchell Stone, at 59 years old, felt the weight of my commercial construction empire pressing down on me as I sat in the dim light of Belmont's. The smell of expensive steak and floor wax usually signaled a win, but tonight, it only made the nausea clawing at my throat feel more real. My hands, which had once hoisted steel beams and laid the foundations for the city's tallest towers, were betraying me. A subtle tremor made the gold nib of the fountain pen dance over the signature line. It was a physical vulnerability I had spent months hiding, a recurring sickness that made the opulent Valentine's Day decor of the restaurant feel like a rotating carousel of red roses and mocking candlelight. Across the table, Gerald Thompson, my business partner of 20 years, sat watching me, his 55-year-old face etched with the impatience of a man who lived for the next zero on his bank statement. He shifted in his seat, his silk tie catching the light from the chandelier. "Mitchell, you have been staring at that line for 3 minutes," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the dining room. "Is there a problem with the numbers?" I blinked, trying to force the swimming figures into alignment. "Just the lighting, Gerald," I managed to rasp, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." I took a shallow breath, grounding myself by focusing on the cold, heavy weight of the pen. I was the king of Stone Enterprises, a man with $45 million in the bank. Yet I felt as though I were drowning in a glass of water. How could a man with $45 million in the bank feel like he was drowning in a glass of water? The room tilted slightly, the edges of the contract fraying into gray shadows. I needed to sign. I needed to finish this deal before the world completely dissolved into the floorboards. But then a rhythmic, heavy sound of footsteps approached. It wasn't the brisk, light-footed pace of the usual service staff. It was slow, deliberate, and carried a weary caution that made me look up. A waitress entered the periphery of our booth. She moved with a struggle that stood in stark contrast to the elegant diners surrounding us, her frame supporting a belly that looked far too heavy for her slender shoulders. I prepared to order a glass of water to clear my head, but as I raised my gaze, the air left my lungs. Hannah Vance, 25, looked like a ghost of her former self, in her stained apron, her 8-month pregnancy making every step a struggle. The woman my son Preston had sworn was a gold digger who had abandoned him for another man and disappeared forever was standing less than 3 feet away. Then I saw her. Not just a waitress. Her. My heart hammered a painful rhythm against my ribs, the dizziness replaced by a cold, piercing recognition that cut through the fog of my illness. "Good evening, gentlemen," she whispered, her voice trembling as she avoided direct eye contact. "Can I start you with some drinks while you look over the menu?" My hand tightened on the pen until the knuckles went white. "Water." I said the word, barely escaping my throat. Just ice water. The woman my son swore had left us for another man stood there 8 months pregnant and trembling, carrying a tray of water in a restaurant I owned half of. The glass of water she placed on the table trembled, sending ripples through my reflection that matched the frantic hammering in my chest. I sat paralyzed, my hand still clutching the gold fountain pen over a contract that suddenly felt like a piece of scrap paper. Hannah Vance stood there, the woman who had once been the bright, sharp-witted light of our family gatherings, now reduced to a ghost in a stained apron. Despite her obvious fear of being seen, she was the one who had approached the table, and as I looked into her hollow eyes, I realized she was either so blinded by exhaustion that she hadn't recognized me until she was inches away, or she was desperate for help she couldn't ask for aloud. My son Preston had spent months painting her as a villain who had fled to Europe with a lover, yet here she was, 8 months pregnant and serving salads to the very men who had supposedly been her victims. Gerald continued to drone on about interest rates and equity splits, his voice a distant hum that I completely ignored. He was oblivious to the fact that the runaway daughter-in-law he'd heard so much about was standing 3 inches from his elbow. I stared at her, searching for the vibrant woman who used to help me navigate the complexities of Stone Enterprises audits with effortless grace. Now her eyes were rimmed with a deep, bruised fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. Hannah, I whispered the name, feeling heavy and strange on my tongue. Is that really you? Her gaze flicked to mine for a fraction of a second, filled with a mixture of raw terror and a pleading silence that broke my heart. I'm just the server, sir. She stammered, her voice a thin, reedy version of the one I remembered. Please, I'll get your salads right away. Now you have to understand, I spent 30 years building Stone Enterprises on the foundation of never walking away from a deal. But at that moment, the money felt like ash. I watched as her hands shook so violently that a silver fork clattered to the floor, the sharp ring of metal on marble drawing glares from the nearby socialites. She didn't even try to pick it up. She turned and began to hurry toward the swinging double doors of the kitchen, her heavy pregnancy making her gait uneven and visibly painful. The sight of her struggling, her pale knuckles white against the tray, sent a surge of protective rage through me that cleared the last of my dizziness. Mitchell, for God's sake, you look like you've seen a ghost. Gerald snapped, finally noticing my shattered composure. Are you having another one of your spells? We need to sign this, Mitchell. Look at the numbers. I looked at the $2.3 million deal and then at the kitchen doors where Hannah had vanished. She was a wounded bird, trying to fly in a hurricane of crystal chandeliers and judgmental whispers. I think I have seen a ghost, Gerald. I said, my voice vibrating with a sudden lethal clarity. Stay here. Don't follow me. I stood up physically, shoving the massive contract aside with a force that sent it sliding toward the edge of the table. I ignored Gerald's protests and the manager's startled cry of Mr. Stone as I broke the sacred boundary of the dining room. I pushed through the kitchen doors, the smell of expensive perfume replaced by a blast of humid heat, determined to catch the woman my son had left for dead. The swinging doors hit the wall with a bang, trading the refined scent of lilies and expensive wine for a wall of humid heat and the stinging stench of industrial degreaser. I stepped into the belly of the beast, my expensive Italian loafers slick on the tile floor, as I ignored the startled looks of the prep line and the hiss of steam from an industrial dishwasher. Tony, the 37-year-old head chef, who normally treated the kitchen like his personal kingdom, stepped back the moment he saw the look in my eyes. He started to protest, his mouth opening to defend his territory, but I cut him off before he could find his voice. Out of the way, Tony, I growled. I am not here for a health inspection. My eyes swept the stainless steel landscape past the barking orders and the clatter of pans until they landed on a shadowed corner by the prep station. Hannah stood there, hunched over her face, buried in her trembling hands. The sheer physical toll of this environment was staggering to witness. A woman in her 8th month of pregnancy standing for hours on slick floors while the stoves roared like furnaces. She had chosen the most high society restaurant in the city to vanish into a brilliant, desperate gamble that she could hide right under my son's nose. Hannah, look at me, I said, my voice softening as I reached her. This ends right now. She flinched as if I had struck her. her eyes darting around the kitchen with the frantic intensity of a trapped bird. She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a dim, narrow hallway near the dry storage. The smell of burnt garlic and heavy grease clung to the air in the confined space. How do you tell a woman who is terrified of your own son that she is safe with you? I was the man who raised the monster she was running from. I looked at her fingers digging into my suit jacket, her grip fueled by pure, raw adrenaline. I saw it then. Not just fear. A total, marrow-deep conviction that my son was the villain of her story. Preston said you left him for another man. I whispered the words, feeling like poison in my mouth. He told the family you were gone, Hannah. He said you took everything. She let out a frantic, breathy rasp that was half sob, half laugh. He'll take him, Mitchell. If he finds out about the baby, he'll take him, and I'll never see him again. Her voice was a ragged whisper against the backdrop of the kitchen's roar. She revealed that Preston hadn't just chased her away. He had actively threatened to have her declared mentally unfit, so he could take the child solely to secure the Stone inheritance line. My own son had weaponized the very family legacy I had spent my life building. I stood frozen, the cold, slick feeling of a stainless steel counter under my hand, the only thing keeping me upright as the foundation of my world collapsed. He didn't want a family. He wanted a bargaining chip. Please, if you ever loved me like a daughter, don't let him know I'm alive. She begged, her uneven breathing, the only sound in our dark corner. I looked at her, then back at the doors, realizing that every second we stood here, the monster I had created was just on the other side of the wood. The sound of Gerald calling my name from the dining room pulled me back to a reality that no longer mattered. I didn't even look back at the $2 million contract or my stunned partner. I simply moved my heavy overcoat catching on the chair as I lunged toward the service exit. The transition was a physical blow to my senses. I left behind the 72-degree ambiance of clinking crystal and hushed privilege charging through the kitchen where line cooks scattered like pigeons. Howard Bell, the 41-year-old manager with a permanent sneer for the underpaid, stepped into my path with a look of practiced concern. "Mr. Stone, sir, you can't be back here," he began, his voice oily with unearned authority. I didn't stop. I shoved past him, my shoulder connecting with his chest, just enough to send him stumbling into a prep table. "Save it for the lawyers, Gerald," I shouted back toward the dining room as the heavy metal door clanged shut behind me. The sudden sharp transition from the restaurant's warmth to the 28-degree Philadelphia winter hit me like a wall of ice. My lungs burned as I inhaled the frigid air, the opulent smells of Belmont's replaced instantly by the stench of garbage-wet cardboard and stale exhaust. I was effectively tanking the most important negotiation of the fiscal year, a $2 million deal that Gerald had spent months grooming. But as the wind whipped through my hair, the money felt like nothing more than paper scrap. For 30 years, I had been Mitchell Stone, the man who never left the table until the ink was dry. Tonight, I was just a man chasing a ghost through the frost. How many times had I sat in that very restaurant eating $500 steaks while my grandson was being fed through a soup kitchen line? The thought was a jagged edge in my throat. I looked down the length of the narrow, lightless alleyway. There in the shadows, beside a rusted dumpster, I spotted a small, trembling silhouette huddled against the damp brick wall. It was Hannah. She was gasping for air, her thin cotton waitress uniform offering no protection against the winter chill. Her hands were clutched tightly over her swollen belly, her shoulders racking with silent, violent tremors. "Hannah, stop, please." "I'm not here to hurt you," I called out, my voice cracking as I stepped into the dim yellow glow of a single security light. She looked up, and the sight of her blue-tinged lips and chattering teeth made my stomach turn. "Mr. Stone, you shouldn't have followed me," she rasped, her voice a desperate, frozen whisper. "If he finds out, you don't know what he'll do. The lies didn't just have layers, they had teeth." "Hannah, look at me," I demanded, coming closer but keeping my hands visible. "Why are you out here? Why did Preston say you ran?" She let out a hollow, bitter sob that sounded like breaking glass. "He didn't just chase me away, Mitchell. He told the owners here, he told Howard, that I was a thief. He said I stole from the family. He wanted me to be watched even here. He wanted me to have nowhere to go." I felt a surge of lethal indignation. I pulled my own heavy wool coat off to wrap around her, but she flinched away with a sharp, instinctive jerk. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it suggested my son's cruelty went far beyond a few mean words. The look in Hannah's eyes wasn't just fear. It was the hollow, haunted expression of someone who had been methodically dismantled by the person they trusted most. As the winter wind bit into my face, she began to dismantle the lies my son Preston had used to poison my mind. Hannah's voice was a jagged, breaking sound as she finally admitted the psychological warfare that had turned my home into a domestic prison. It wasn't just the words, though his labels of worthless and gold digger had cut deep enough while she was working 60-hour weeks as a freelance accountant to pay for their mortgage. The real horror began with the gaslighting. She described how Brooke Sterling hadn't just appeared after Hannah left. Brooke was already there, moved into their guest room months prior, under the guise of being a business consultant. "Mitchell, he didn't just hit me!" She rasped, her chattering teeth sounding like dry bones. "He made me feel like I didn't exist in my own home." I stood near the metallic, sharp-smelling dumpster, nauseated by the betrayal. Brooke was already there. "While you were still living under that roof," I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The realization that I had raised a man capable of such cruelty felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. My own blood. My own flesh. He was a stranger to me now. He wasn't just my son. He was a predator who had converted his own house into a siege. But the betrayal went even deeper. Brooke Sterling wasn't some stranger Preston had found in a bar. She was my own former junior associate, a woman I had personally fired for egregious ethics violations. Preston had secretly hired her back behind my back, bringing a wolf into the very heart of his home to devour his wife. Hannah detailed a living nightmare, where Brooke began wearing Hannah's clothes and jewelry while Hannah was still living there. They would sit in the dining room laughing as if she were a ghost, or a piece of furniture, openly discussing their future together. She wore my wedding anniversary dress to dinner in our own home. Hannah said, her white-knuckled fingers gripping her pregnant belly so hard I feared for the child. And my son, he just let this happen, he encouraged it. I asked, my righteous indignation boiling into a cold, lethal fury. They weren't just having an affair. They were conducting a slow-motion execution of Hannah's soul. Every story Hannah told stripped away another layer of the respect I once had for my own legacy. My son had spent my money to facilitate a domestic execution, and I had been too busy expanding stone enterprises to see the rot in my own foundation. I reached out to steady her, the biting sting of the wind, a distant annoyance compared to the fire in my chest. Hannah's voice dropped to a terrified whisper as she looked over my shoulder toward the restaurant door, her body going stiff with a fresh wave of panic. But Mitchell Brooke wasn't just there for the money. She set her eyes wide with a terror that suggested the worst was yet to come. She brought the powders. She said they were to help you retire early. A cold sweat that had nothing to do with the February wind broke across my neck as the word powders fell from Hannah's lips, snapping my own months of fatigue into a terrifying new focus. My world began to spin, not with the familiar vertigo I'd been battling, but with the nauseating clarity of a man realizing the roof he built is rigged to collapse. I realized in that heartbeat that my dizzy spells and the sudden unexplained lapses in my strength weren't the inevitable toll of aging or the stress of my empire. They were a design. Hannah's mention of Brooke bringing powders confirmed that I was being actively poisoned by the same monster who had dismantled her life. I reached out to steady her, but her knees buckled before my fingers could gain a purchase on her thin uniform. She slumped into the snow-dusted gravel of the alley, clutching her stomach and gasping in a way that made my blood run cold. The winter chill and the sheer weight of her terror had finally broken the last of her endurance. "Hannah, stay with me, look at me." I roared, the sound echoing off the brick walls of Belmont's like a gunshot. I didn't care who heard. I didn't care about the $2 million contract sitting cold on the table inside. "Henry, bring the car around to the service gate." Now I screamed into my phone, my voice raw with a paternal desperation I hadn't felt in decades. Henry, my 46-year-old driver who had been with me through 3 construction booms and a divorce, didn't ask a single question as he vaulted over the hood of the car, tires screeching against the frozen asphalt. My grandson was in that womb. My legacy, my future, shivering and fading in the back of a car while I sat there powerless. It was a visceral, gut-wrenching realization that eclipsed every professional triumph I had ever achieved. I lifted Hannah's frail weight, shocked at how little there was of her beneath the heavy pregnancy, and settled her into the leather back seat. The contrast between my luxury vehicle and her threadbare, stained uniform was a nauseating reminder of the distance she'd fallen under my son's shadow. Henry tore through the Philadelphia streets, ignoring red lights and the honking of lesser men. I held Hannah's hand, feeling the terrifyingly weak pulse against my palm while she drifted in and out of consciousness, her skin freezing and clammy. Philadelphia's lights blurred into long, mocking streaks of neon as we raced against a clock that had been ticking behind my back for 8 months. Every thud of my heart against my ribs was a countdown. "Don't you dare close your eyes, Hannah. Your son needs you. I need you." I whispered, my voice thick with protective fury. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open for a moment, glazed with pain. "Mr. Stone, the powders. He puts them in the morning. Your coffee." She muddled, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. She mumbled that Brooke hadn't just brought them. She had bragged about the industrial chemical supplier, where she bought them, a detail Brooke likely thought Hannah was too broken to remember. The automatic doors of the Penn Medicine ER hissed open, smelling of hospital antiseptic and floor wax. I didn't wait for a gurney. I carried her in myself under the blinding white fluorescent lights, screaming for help, until a swarm of white coats surrounded us, tearing her from my arms into the sterile unknown. The smell of hospital antiseptic fought a losing battle against the metallic scent of my own fear as I stared at the blood-stained sleeve of my $3,000 suit. I paced the linoleum floors of the Penn Medicine waiting room, my ears ringing with the clinical rhythmic squeak of rubber shoes on hospital linoleum. I felt a crushing remorse as I learned from the intake nurse that Hannah had actually been to this hospital months ago. She had fled before being seen because she spotted one of Preston's business associates in the lobby, a detail that made me realize she had been living like a fugitive in my own city, while I was busy closing multi-million-dollar construction deals. Dr. Catherine Mills, a 53-year-old OB-GYN, with eyes that had seen too much sorrow and not enough justice, stepped into the light of the waiting room. Is he okay?" I asked, my voice cracking like a dry timber. She exhaled, her expression softening just enough to let me breathe. "He's a fighter, Mr. Stone, but his mother is running on empty. She's suffering from extreme dehydration, stage 1 anemia, and severe exhaustion. She hasn't had a proper meal in days." The diagnosis of neglect was a physical blow to my chest. My grandson was miraculously stable, but he was flourishing at the cost of his mother's life. How could a man who built skyscrapers fail to build a simple roof of safety for his own family? I spent 30 years hoisting steel and glass into the heavens. Yet I had allowed the foundation of my own bloodline to erode in the gutters of North Philly. I refused to leave Hannah in a public ward where my son might find her. Using my influence, I had her discharged under a pseudonym and signaled Henry to bring the car around. "We're using the service elevator," Henry whispered, as we moved her through the hospital's bowels. No one sees her enter. The drive to the city center was a blur of neon and guilt. I took her to the Regency, to the presidential suite that usually hosted foreign dignitaries and tech moguls. The hotel bill was $5,000 a night. It felt cheap compared to her life. I had the entire floor put on a maintenance lockout, effectively making Hannah a ghost within the city's most famous hotel. I watched as she slept in the soft, high-thread count sheets. The dry, recycled air of the suite hummed in the background. Her pale face finally lost its mask of terror. In the luxury of the deep pillows, her breathing evening out in the silence of the city at 2 a.m. from the 40th floor. "You're safe now, Hannah," I promised, adjusting the heavy silk duvet. "I promise." I sat in a velvet armchair, the scratchy feeling of blood drying on my wool sleeve a constant reminder of the night's cost. I felt a cold, emerging rage. I wasn't just tired anymore. I was a man who had finally seen the blueprint of his own son's betrayal. As I watched the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Preston, asking if I'd recovered from my dizzy spell yet. He was mocking me, checking the status of his slow-motion execution, while I held the wreckage of his victims in my hands. The morning sun hit the glass towers of Philadelphia with a blinding clinical intensity. As I prepared for a war I never wanted to fight, I didn't bother calling ahead. I simply leaned my weight against the doorbell of Preston's glass-walled fortress, the vibration echoing the cold, rhythmic thumping of my heart. Preston Stone, my 35-year-old son, stood in the doorway of his luxury loft, with an air of unearned superiority that I had finally begun to see through. He was wearing a designer silk robe and holding a steaming cup of espresso, looking more inconvenienced than concerned by my presence. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice smooth and patronizing. "You look terrible. Did you have another one of your episodes?" "You're pale, Mitchell. Maybe you should be at home with a nurse instead of wandering the city." It was the same gaslighting I had endured for months, his subtle references to my dizzy spells, designed to make me feel senile and incompetent. "I'm here to find out when exactly your soul became as hollow as this apartment, Preston," I said, pushing past him into the living area. The place was a monument to sterile wealth, all white marble and floor-to-ceiling windows, yet it felt devoid of any real humanity. I noticed 2 coffee cups on the kitchen island and a pair of discarded silk heels near the sofa. The smell of expensive, bitter espresso hung heavy in the air, a scent that normally I enjoyed, but now made my stomach churn with the memory of Hannah's revelation about the powders. "How do you look at the person you raised and realize you're staring into the eyes of a predator?" I had built a construction empire based on solid foundations, but the man I called my son was built on shifting sand and stolen lives. Brooke Sterling, 32, lounged on the sofa in a silk robe that I knew belonged to Hannah, her cold eyes showing no remorse as she acknowledged me with a thin, mocking smile. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It's lovely to see you're still upright." I looked at her and saw the junior associate I had personally fired for forging expense reports, the same woman Preston had secretly brought into his home to replace his wife. She was wearing Hannah's robe, sipping from Hannah's cup, living Hannah's life. The soft, mocking rustle of the silk as she crossed her legs was like a physical slap to my face. "Where is she, Preston? Where is my daughter-in-law?" I demanded, my hand gripping the cold, smooth edge of the marble island to steady the tremor in my fingers. Preston exchanged a look of silent conspiratorial amusement with Brooke before turning back to me. He leaned back against the counter, a smug grin touching his lips as he reached for a manila envelope. "I didn't want to tell you, Dad, because of your fragile health. But your precious Hannah didn't just leave. She robbed us blind before she ran. He slid the envelope across the marble toward me with a flourish. I found the proof. She's been siphoning funds from Stone Enterprises for months. My own son was looking me in the eye, handing me a forged document of his own crimes, and expecting me to be too weak to see the lie. The paternal loyalty I had carried for 35 years died in that room, replaced by a cold, calculating fury that he wouldn't understand until it was too late. I didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, I let out a low, dry chuckle that seemed to rattle the very floor-to-ceiling windows of my son's glass palace. It was the laughter of a man who had finally seen the punchline of a very dark joke. Preston's smug grin faltered, his eyes darting to Brooke, as if checking the script they had so carefully rehearsed. If Hannah truly robbed Stone Enterprises blind, Preston, then you are a far more incompetent vice president than I ever feared, I said, my voice cutting through the metallic, ozone-like smell of cold fury in the room. You're telling me that a freelance accountant managed to siphon millions from under your nose. By your own logic, you failed to protect the firm's assets. Consider yourself terminated for gross negligence, effective immediately. The satisfaction on his face curdled into a mask of confusion. He hadn't expected me to accept the theft as a premise to destroy his career. I watched Brooke's confidence flicker, her eyes scanning the exits as she realized I wasn't buying the performance. You think a manila envelope full of lies is going to distract me from what I saw in your eyes? I asked, leaning into his space. Dad, you're not well. Preston stammered, trying to regain his footing. You're being paranoid. The dizziness is clouding your judgment. You need to go home and lie down before you do something you regret. Do you know how it feels to watch your own creation turn its teeth toward you? It's a silence that screams a realization that the person you gave everything to is simply waiting for you to rot. I pulled out my phone, the sharp mechanical click of the smartphone screen sounding like a cocked pistol in the quiet loft. With a few deliberate taps, I sent a pre-drafted authorization to my CFO. I've just frozen your corporate accounts and suspended your trust disbursements, Preston. You have 24 hours to produce real proof of Hannah's theft. Not these amateur forgeries, or you'll find yourself as penniless as the woman you threw away. I've spent 30 years building an empire, and I won't let you turn it into a playground for a mistress and a coward. The trust was gone. The sun was gone. Only the construction remained. Preston's mask finally shattered. His face contorted, neck veins bulging like thick cables as he lunged toward the kitchen island. You can't do this, he screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, unadulterated rage. That money is mine by right. It's my legacy, not hers. I didn't flinch. I turned my back on him, walking toward the heavy oak door. Brooke remained silent, a calculating viper already weighing the value of a man with no bank account. I didn't care. The air in the loft was thick with the stench of his entitlement, and I needed to be gone before I choked on it. I reached the handle, my hand steady despite the adrenaline roaring through my system. I had finally severed the tie. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard him throw the espresso cup against the wall. I closed the door on his screams, a heavy thud that felt like the final brick in a tomb. But his final words echoed through the wood, a chilling promise that vibrated in the hallway like a curse. Check your pulse, old man. You're already a ghost. You won't live long enough to see me lose a dime. Preston's parting threat about being a ghost followed me into the elevator, vibrating in the marrow of my bones as I scrubbed at the invisible stain of his words. I stood in the mirrored silence of the lift, watching my own reflection. I looked weary, the skin beneath my eyes sagging with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. But my mind was sharpening into a weapon. I realized as the numbers descended that Hannah's disappearance hadn't been an act of cowardice or a simple flight from a crumbling marriage. It was a tactical retreat. She had gone into the shadows, not just to save herself, but to protect the evidence she had spent months gathering against the man who shared my name. I stepped back into the presidential suite at the Regency, the plush silence a stark contrast to the venomous shouting I had left behind at the loft. Hannah was awake, sitting up in the massive bed. She looked small against the backdrop of the silk headboard, her eyes searching mine for news of the world she had fled. I sat at the edge of the mattress, the physical weight of the morning pressing on my shoulders. I told her I had frozen Preston's accounts, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope extinguish the terror in her gaze. "He is never going to stop Mitchell," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the suite's climate control. "He thinks he owns the air I breathe." I took her hand, finding it cold, but steady. "Then we will take the air back, Hannah, starting with the money." How could I have missed it? I pride myself on being a man who sees the structural integrity of everything, yet I was blind to the rot in my own foundations. I had spent 40 years inspecting blueprints for microscopic flaws, while a catastrophic failure was happening in my own living room. Hannah asked me to bring her the small battered nylon backpack she had arrived with. I felt the rough texture of the material, a cheap thing that seemed out of place in this room of velvet and gold. She reached into a hidden seam in the lining, her fingers moving with practiced precision, and pulled out a thin, black-bound ledger. It smelled of old paper and dust, a ghost of the life she had tried to keep. She opened it on the duvet, the silence of the suite punctuated only by the dry rustle of turning pages. She began to point out the discrepancies, showing me where $750,000 had been siphoned through shell companies I never authorized. The numbers didn't lie. My son did. 750,000, I repeated the figure, tasting like ash. He didn't just steal from the company, Hannah. He stole from your future. I realized then that my daughter-in-law had been my silent guardian long before she became a fugitive. As I turned the final page, my heart gave a sickening lurch. The ledger was filled with sharp, jagged handwriting in the margins, notes written by Brooke Sterling. She was the architect of the embezzlement long before she ever moved into the house, but it was the folded piece of paper tucked at the very back that stopped my breath. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling. It was a receipt for a chemical supply warehouse with Brooke's signature, dated the week before my episodes began. The ghost Preston spoke of was finally taking a physical form. The small slip of paper in my hand felt heavier than any steel beam I'd ever hoisted. It was the physical proof that my son and his mistress weren't just waiting for me to die. They were helping the process along. I stared at the chemical warehouse receipt, my vision blurring at the edges. Hannah sat at the edge of the Regency's bed, her voice a hollow whisper, as she finally unburdened herself of the secret that had nearly killed her. She explained the night she had retreated to the shadows of the kitchen, overhearing Preston and Brooke. She described seeing Brooke hand my son a small vial of white powder, claiming with a chilling clinicality that it would mimic the natural decline of an aging heart without leaving a trace. Hannah revealed that she didn't just see the powder. She had actually attempted to swap the original vial for powdered sugar, once hoping to buy time. But Brooke was too sharp. She noticed the texture was wrong within hours, and that discovery had triggered the final, terrifying confrontation that forced Hannah to flee for her life. "Mitchell, they called it the inheritance accelerator," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "They laughed about it while they brewed your tea." The nauseating clarity of her words hit me harder than any physical blow. My own son, the boy I had taught to build and to lead, was stirring my own grave into my morning cup every single day. The metallic taste in my mouth, the one I had dismissed as a side effect of stress, was the flavor of my only child's betrayal. Is there a word for the moment you realize the person you'd give your life for is actively trying to take it? I looked at my hands, the hands that had founded an empire, and saw them trembling with a cold, clinical rage. I couldn't be a victim anymore. I had to become a hunter. I contacted Dr. Alan Fisher, a 58-year-old toxicologist with a clinical detachment that hid a fierce loyalty and met him at the side entrance of his private lab. I drove myself across the city, avoiding Henry, to ensure my movements left no footprint. The muffled, echoing silence of the empty lab was a sanctuary as Alan prepared the equipment. "Mitchell, you look gray," he said, his voice grave. "If what you suspect is true, we don't have much time." I didn't offer an explanation. I simply rolled up my sleeve. The sharp, stinging scent of rubbing alcohol filled the air, followed by the cold, biting pressure of the tourniquet. The needle didn't hurt. The truth did. As the needle entered my vein, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. I was gathering the ammunition I needed to dismantle their glass-walled fortress. The dark, sluggish blood began to fill the vial, a physical manifestation of the poison that had been clouding my judgment and sapping my strength. I watched the liquid rise, focused on the mission ahead. Alan paused, his brow furrowing as he noticed dark, ugly bruising along my forearm marks I couldn't explain. He traced them with a gloved finger, a sign that the toxins were already causing internal damage. "Doctor." Fisher looked at the dark, sluggish blood filling the vial and whispered, "Mitchell, if this is what I think it is, you shouldn't even be standing." I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I just stood there, a dying man, finally finding the strength to finish a war he never wanted. The ghost of Alan's warning stayed in the passenger seat, with me a cold passenger that made every breath feel like a borrowed gift I was forced to fight for. I left the private lab behind my arm, still throbbing where the needle had drawn out my dark, sluggish blood. As I drove toward Old City, a sickening pattern began to emerge in my mind. I realized that my most debilitating dizzy spells were never random. They were meticulously timed, always striking just hours before a major company board meeting. While I was collapsed in my study, gasping for air, Preston was standing in the boardroom as my proxy, authorizing the very shell company transfers that had drained my legacy. I arrived at a nondescript office far from the polished glass and steel of Stone Enterprises. Rebecca Sinclair, a 48-year-old forensic accountant, with a mind like a razor and a reputation for finding money in places it had no right to be, didn't even offer me a hand to shake. She pointed to a chair, her eyes already scanning the ledger Hannah had saved. "I want every penny tracked, Rebecca," I told her, the blue glow of the monitor reflecting in my tired eyes. "I want to see the blood on the trail." She didn't look up, her fingers creating a rhythmic, annoying clicking on the keyboard that filled the small, stale-smelling room. "This isn't just theft, Mitchell," she whispered. "This is a systematic erasure of corporate assets. How do you rebuild a foundation when you're the one who let the rot in? I was the architect of my own ruin, a man who built monuments but couldn't see the termite at the base." The silence in the room was heavy with the weight of 30 years of trust being ground into dust. Rebecca suddenly paused, her screen flashing with red flags. She pointed to two names on the payroll, Leo Grant and Marcus Thorne. Both had been terminated for gross negligence 6 months ago. She cross-referenced their login IDs with the siphon transactions, proving that Preston had used their credentials to move $750,000 while they were out on site visits. I felt physically ill. I had looked into those boys' eyes and called them thieves, while my own son was the one holding the knife. Leo had a toddler. Marcus had a mortgage. My son had Brooke. I had signed their termination papers personally, believing the proof Preston had manufactured. The guilt was a suffocating pressure in my chest. "He used them, Mitchell." Rebecca said, her voice a clinical blade. "They were the sacrificial lambs for his offshore accounts." I stared at the screen, my clinical fury mounting as she uncovered the final layer of the shell company registration. They weren't just in Preston's name. They were registered under Brooke Sterling's maiden name. She was the primary beneficiary, the puppet master pulling the strings of my son's greed. Rebecca looked up from her screen, her face turning a ghastly shade of pale as she leaned closer to the monitor. "Mitchell, it's worse than the money. She whispered the hum of the computer fans, suddenly sounding like a roar in the small office. Look at the insurance policy amendment Preston filed last month. He didn't just want the company. He was betting on my death. I stared at the insurance amendment until the numbers burned into my retinas, a death warrant, signed by my own flesh and blood, and gift-wrapped in corporate fine print. The dry, papery smell of the documents in Rebecca's office felt like the dust of a tomb. It wasn't just an increase in premiums. Preston had used the biometric data from my own tablet while I lay in a drug-induced stupor during one of my recovery naps to forge my digital signature. He had increased the accidental death rider to a staggering $10 million. $10 million, Rebecca, I asked, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. He couldn't even wait for nature to take its course. Rebecca didn't look up from her monitor, her face pale in the artificial glow. He's not waiting for nature, Mitchell. He's accelerating the schedule. The timing of the amendment perfectly aligned with the onset of my dizzy spells, confirming that my murder was no longer a matter of if, but a planned financial transaction. I felt a hollow coldness in my chest, a void where paternal pride had once lived. The son I had raised, the boy I had taught to hold a hammer and a compass, saw me only as a decaying asset to be liquidated for a payout. I left that office walking like a man through waist-deep water, the weight of the insurance papers dragging at my very soul. The Philadelphia skyline, which I had spent 30 years helping to shape, looked like a collection of jagged teeth ready to snap shut. I returned to the Regency Hotel, my body trembling with a weary determination that bordered on the lethal. I needed to see Hannah. I needed to see the only pure thing left in the wreckage of the Stone legacy. The rhythmic thrumming of the hotel suite's air conditioning was the only sound as I entered. Hannah was resting, the terror in her eyes finally beginning to recede under the safety of the lockout. To calm her nerves, I sat by her side and began to read a story, my voice a low, gravely rumble in the quiet room. As I read, I rested my hand on the warmth of her stomach through the soft cotton of her robe. Suddenly, a sharp electric jolt struck my palm. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Did you feel that? Hannah whispered, a small, genuine smile breaking through her exhaustion. He's awake. It was the first time I had felt my grandson move a sudden heel against my palm that felt more solid than any skyscraper foundation I had ever poured. Hello there, Owen. I murmured the name, feeling like a sacred oath on my tongue. Your grandpa isn't going anywhere. I promise you that. How can something so small, a tiny heel against a palm, overturn a lifetime of corporate cynicism? In that moment, my desire for survival shifted. It was no longer about self-preservation or spite. It was a holy war. I realized that Owen's kicks were strongest when I spoke, the boy already recognizing the voice of the man who would stand between him and the monster I had sired. As I looked at Hannah's peaceful face, I knew I couldn't just play defense anymore. It was time to let the arsenic do its work, or at least make Preston think it was. I had to become the ghost he already thought I was. The shrill ring of my phone cut through the heavy, artificial silence of the house, pulling me away from a moment of hollow contemplation. I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk as Dr. Fisher's voice crackled through the line, each syllable acting like a sledgehammer against the last remnants of my denial. It is arsenic, Mitchell Allen, said, his clinical tone failing to hide the underlying tremor of alarm. A high-purity industrial grade. Whoever is doing this knows exactly how to keep you just on the edge of death without crossing the line too soon. He explained that the small repeated doses over the last 6 months were responsible for the dizziness and the internal spells that had made me feel like a failing machine. I sat in my study, staring at my own gray, sunken face in the polished wood of the desk. I discovered that the fortified tea Preston had been bringing me every morning wasn't just laced with poison. It was infused with a specific sedative designed to cloud my judgment, making me more susceptible to his financial suggestions. The betrayal was complete. Then they have made a mistake, Alan. I replied, my voice a cold, dispassionate rasp. They left me enough life to bury them. There was no more grief in me, only the clinical necessity of a counterattack. I had to be a ghost before I could be a judge. I was the architect of a building that had been rigged with explosives, but I was the only one who knew where the detonator was hidden. I began the secret medical protocol. Alan had provided a series of chelating agents to flush the rot from my system. I spent the afternoon clearing out my medicine cabinet, hiding the antidote inside my daily vitamin bottles. The first detox pill had a bitter, chalky taste that I welcomed like a benediction. Every time I took my medicine in front of the household staff, or my son, I would actually be healing while they watched me fade. How much does a soul cost? Apparently for Preston, it was the price of a $10 million insurance rider. I stood before the hallway mirror practicing the stumble of a dying man and the slight slur of a tongue losing its grip on speech. I leaned into the performance, letting my shoulders slump and my eyes wander. I had to lure Preston into a final arrogant blunder by becoming exactly what he expected. I realized that by acting sicker than I truly was, I could force him to accelerate his crimes. He was greedy, and greed makes men sloppy when they think the finish line is in sight. I wanted him to rush to leave a hurried trail of digital breadcrumbs for the forensic accountants to find. I wanted him to think he was winning. I wanted him to believe the Stone legacy was ripe for the taking. The rhythmic mocking chime of the doorbell echoed through the house, signaling the arrival of the monster. My pulse quickened, but I forced my features into a mask of pathetic exhaustion. I heard his jaunty footsteps on the hardwood, a sound that used to bring me a father's joy, but now felt like a countdown. I slumped into my armchair in the study, letting my jaw go slightly slack and my hand tremble against the armrest as I prepared to welcome my only child into the room for our daily ritual of slow-motion murder. I let my arm hang limp over the side of the wingback chair, tracking the sound of Preston's footsteps as they crossed the hardwood. Each step a rhythmic reminder of the predator I had welcomed into my home. The sound of his jaunty gait used to bring me a father's simple joy, but today it felt like a countdown toward a confrontation I was finally ready to win. I kept my jaw slack and my eyes partially lidded, feigning the heavy lethargy of a man whose central nervous system was slowly being extinguished. As he entered the study, I noticed he wasn't just bringing me a tray. He was carrying a small cardboard box. Through my lashes, I watched him stop at the far wall and calmly remove the framed photograph of my late wife and me at the Stone Enterprises groundbreaking ceremony. He placed it face down in the box with a clinical silence that chilled me more than the poison ever could. He was literally erasing my presence from the room while I was still drawing breath inside it. "You look tired today," Dad Preston said, his voice a smooth, practiced imitation of concern. "Have you been taking your supplements?" I let out a thin, shaky rasp, the sound of a hollowed-out man. "Everything feels so heavy, Preston," I whispered. "Like my blood is turning to lead." He offered me a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes and set the tray down on the mahogany table. I heard the delicate, mocking clink of the porcelain cups. The bitter, earthy scent of the poisoned Earl Grey rose from the steam, a fragrance that now signaled death instead of comfort. He pushed the cup with the chipped rim toward me, the one Hannah had warned me about. Did he ever really love me? Or was I just a project to be completed? A structure to be demolished for the lot value? I watched the small white ring left by the cup on the polished wood, a permanent stain on my history. Preston turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, murmuring about a draft and reaching to close the heavy latch. It was the moment I had rehearsed in my mind 1,000 times. I moved with a silent, desperate speed that defied my supposed frailty, swapping our cups in a blurred motion that made my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy, humid weight of the silence after the swap was suffocating. When he turned back, my hand was already trembling as I reached for the handle of the safe cup. "Drink up, Mitchell," he said, using my name with an arrogant familiarity that proved he already considered me a ghost. It is a special blend, Brooke found. Very restorative. I watched him take a deep, satisfied sip from the cup meant for me. He swallowed. He smiled. He signed his own confession with a sip. I felt a cold, dark satisfaction as the poison and the sedative meant for the father began its journey into the son. Because I had been secretly detoxing for days, I knew the inheritance accelerator would hit his clean system with the force of a freight train. I hope it is as effective as you say, I murmured, watching the rim of his cup. As Preston stood to leave, he stumbled slightly, his hand catching the edge of the desk. His eyes glazed over for a fraction of a second, the first sign that the dose was already claiming its new host. I waited until the taillights of Preston's Audi faded into the Philadelphia drizzle before I grabbed my keys. The ghost of his stumble still playing behind my eyes like a satisfying loop of cinematic justice. The arsenic and sedative meant for me were now pulsing through his own veins, a poetic irony that gave me a grim surge of energy despite my own weary frame. I drove through the slick streets of the city, my hands steady on the wheel for the first time in months. I headed to a subterranean parking garage near Independence Hall, a cold concrete cavern where the air was thick with the scent of damp pavement and lingering exhaust. Mark Sullivan, a 50-year-old private investigator, with the weathered skin of a man who lived in the city's shadows and a silence that I had paid for in six-figure retainers, stood by the driver's side door of a nondescript black sedan. He didn't offer a greeting, which I appreciated. We were well beyond the pleasantries of polite society. I realized as he reached for a tablet that Brooke Sterling hadn't just been sloppy. She had been arrogant. She had used a stolen ID belonging to Marcus Thorne, one of the junior employees Preston had framed to make her purchases. She believed she was burying the trail, but in her greed, she had only ensured that the person buying the poison left a digital signature that didn't match the face on the security cameras. "Did you find it, Mark?" I asked, my voice echoing against the low ceiling. "Tell me she was sloppy." Mark tapped the tablet, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen. "She thought she was a ghost, Mitchell," he replied. "But everyone leaves a footprint." The air around us felt heavy, the flickering buzzy hum of an old fluorescent light above us, adding to the clinical atmosphere of the exchange. How much planning goes into a murder? I wondered if they'd scheduled my funeral between their brunch dates, or if they had already picked out the champagne for the day the life insurance cleared. Mark handed me the tablet, and I felt the cold glass under my fingertip. The surveillance footage was grainy and black and white, but there she was. My son's future. My executioner. Brooke was wearing a poorly fitted wig and oversized dark glasses, entering an industrial chemical outlet on the edge of town. I watched her sign the electronic pad for a restricted batch of trioxide, the primary component of the poison that had been sapping my strength for 8 months. I watched her smile at the clerk, a charming, lethal viper, purchasing the tools for my execution with my own company credit card through a shell company. Mark Sullivan watched my reaction, his eyes dispassionate. "That's her," I whispered. "Even with the wig, look at the way she walks." "That's Brooke. I have the clerk's testimony ready too." Mark added, his voice low. He remembers the lady in the black car very well. He thought she was a scientist or a laboratory runner. I felt a surge of physical nausea, not from the toxins this time, but from the sheer, naked depth of the betrayal. Mark tapped the screen again, bringing up a separate file that made my heart freeze. "There's one more thing, Mitchell. Brooke isn't just buying chemicals. She's been making inquiries about quick estate liquidations. And she's been meeting with a lawyer who specializes in international extradition. They aren't just waiting for me to die. They are already packing their bags." I didn't wait for the garage door to fully rise before I accelerated the plan for Brooke's international flight, acting like a shot of pure adrenaline that temporarily masked the tremors in my hands. The city lights of Philadelphia blurred into a cage of neon, but for the first time, I held the key. I arrived back at the Regency and executed the extraction with surgical precision. To solidify the decoy, I instructed Henry to drive the Regency town car straight to the airport and leave it in long-term parking, ensuring Brooke and her associates would believe we had already fled the state. Meanwhile, I moved Hannah under the cover of a late-night laundry delivery, her frail form hidden beneath piles of white linen as we slipped out the service entrance. We drove in a nondescript sedan to my private villa at Rittenhouse Square, a secondary property I'd kept off the corporate books for decades. It was a place Preston hadn't set foot in since his mother's funeral. A limestone fortress forgotten by the very son who thought he knew all my secrets. As I helped her through the heavy iron gates and heard the comforting, heavy click of the villa's deadbolt, I felt the shift in her energy. The fortress was no longer a sterile hotel room, but a home. I had already commissioned a nursery to be built in secret, and as she stepped into the room, the smell of lavender and fresh paint greeted her. "It's beautiful, Mitchell," she whispered, her fingers brushing the railing of the crib. "It smells like safety." Watching her face in that moment was the only payment I needed for the risk I was taking. He thought he was the hunter. He was just the dog chasing a scent I'd laid out in the mud. He didn't know about this place, and I intended to keep it that way. While Hannah settled into the silk sheets of the master guest suite, my son was currently miles away, wasting his remaining energy in the damp, dangerous alleys of North Philadelphia. I had leaked a rumor through one of Gerald's less than discreet associates that a woman matching Hannah's description was seen working at a 24-hour diner near Temple University. Mark Sullivan sent a brief surveillance clip to my encrypted tablet, and I watched with grim satisfaction. Preston looked frantic and disheveled, his designer coat stained by the gritty drizzle as he searched the slums. Does a father ever truly stop feeling the sting of his child's failure? Even when that child is trying to kill him, there is a hollow ache that no amount of justice can fill. But as I watched him dig through the trash, I realized his mind lived there anyway. "Let him search Henry," I murmured to my driver as he stood by the door. "A desperate man is a loud man, and Preston is becoming very loud." However, as the footage continued, my brow furrowed. Preston wasn't just looking for Hannah. He was meeting with a known low-level criminal in a back-alley handoff. I realized then that my son wasn't just looking to find her. He was looking to hire someone to finish the job Brooke had started. He wanted the loose end tied permanently. I turned off the surveillance monitor, the silence of the villa wrapping around me like a shroud. I looked at the nursery door, feeling a brief moment of peace, but it was shattered by a sharp, sudden sound from the other room. A sharp, sudden gasp for air followed by a cry of pain. I rushed in to find Hannah clutching the bedpost, her face pale. "Mitchell," she gasped, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "It's time." Her water had just broken. I was across the room before the sound of the splashing water even hit my brain, my instincts as a builder overriding the arsenic-induced fog as I caught Hannah before she could slide to the floor. The smell of amniotic fluid mixing with expensive floor wax filled the air, a sharp organic scent that didn't belong in the sterile quiet of the Rittenhouse villa. My knees hit the cold, wet sensation of the floor with a dull thud, but I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the frantic, fluttering pulse in Hannah's wrist as she gasped for air. I realized with a jolt of ice in my veins that her labor was likely accelerated by a minor car-side encounter she had earlier that day with a delivery driver. A man I now suspected was one of Preston's scouts. The shadow was no longer at the gate. It was inside the perimeter. Hannah was gripped by her first major contraction, her face twisting in a mask of pain that made my heart stop. I checked the sharp, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, 2:00 a.m. We were still weeks away from her due date, which meant the stress of the past month and the fear of the man I had sired had finally triggered an early arrival. "Breathe, Hannah," Just breathe. I commanded my voice, a gravely anchor in the storm. I've built skyscrapers in hurricanes. We can handle a baby in the rain. I struggled to keep my own hands from shaking as I guided her to the velvet sofa. How do you protect a new life when the world is actively trying to extinguish your own? I was a dying man, trying to be a midwife in a house that was quickly becoming a cage. Before I explain what that hidden hospital bag truly means for our escape, are you still with me? Comment A. If you think we should run now, or B. If we should wait for the contractions to move closer, and tell me why in 5 words. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. If that is not for you, you are free to stop here. I made the call to Henry using an encrypted line giving him the code for the secondary garage exit. Henry, the back lane. Now. And turn off the headlamps, I whispered into the phone, my eyes darting toward the iron gates visible through the dark windows. While he moved, I gathered the hospital bag we'd hidden in the nursery, my mind racing through the logistics of the private access agreement I'd made with Penn Medicine. Every groan from Hannah felt like a countdown. Mitchell, she whimpered, her fingers bruising my forearm. If Preston finds us at the hospital, he won't let us leave. The pain didn't just break her silence. It shattered my illusion of safety. As I helped Hannah toward the door, leaning her weight against my shoulder, I saw it. A faint, tiny red laser dot was dancing on the silk wallpaper of the nursery wall, moving with predatory grace. Preston's scout isn't just looking. They've already found the villa. I shoved Hannah into the shadows of the hallway as the small red light swept across the glass, realizing that the hospital run wasn't just a medical emergency anymore. It was an extraction from a kill zone. I didn't wait for a second sweep of that red eye. I hauled Hannah toward the heavy service door, my boots skidding on the stone as the car's engine roared to life in the darkened back lane. The sound of the heavy car door slamming and the screech of tires echoed through the villa as Henry made his move. I stayed low in the back seat, shielding Hannah's trembling body with mine as she breathed through a massive bone-rattling contraction. In reality, I had instructed Henry to leak our location to Preston's associate earlier that night on purpose. I needed to force a confrontation on my own timeline, while the police were already positioned, but the biological clock of the birth had accelerated everything into a frantic, dangerous blur. Henry drove with tactical precision, weaving through the narrow cobblestone backstreets of Philadelphia to lose any potential tail. The smell of burning rubber and cold rain filled the cabin as we executed a sharp, illegal turn onto a one-way street. I watched the rearview mirror, spotting a pair of headlights that lingered a bit too long before Henry successfully broke the line of sight. "Lose them, Henry." I growled, my poisoned heart pumping on pure adrenaline. "I don't care about the tires." "Stay down, sir," he replied, his voice a steady anchor. "We're 2 blocks from the perimeter. Have you ever felt the future of your entire bloodline screaming in the back seat of a moving car? It's a sound that erases every dollar I ever made, every skyscraper I ever raised into the sky." We reached the secondary ambulance bay at Penn Medicine, a restricted zone I'd secured weeks ago through a substantial equipment donation. The gates slid open only after Henry flashed a specific security badge, and we were immediately met by the blinding blue-white glare of the industrial ER lights. Dr. Mills and a discreet team of nurses were already waiting. The gurney wheels made a rhythmic, sharp thud on the bay floor as they rushed toward us. Hannah's hand gripped mine with terrifying strength, her knuckles white as a ghost's. "She's fully dilated, Catherine, move." I shouted, the urgency clawing at my throat. "I've got her, Mitchell, doctor," Mills replied, her eyes clinical and focused. "You stay back until we prep the room." The doors hissed. The world narrowed. The end began. As the car stopped and the nurses took over, Henry leaned into the window and handed me a burner phone. He had recovered it from the scout we bypassed at the villa gate. The vibration of the phone against my palm felt like a live wire. I checked the logs, my blood turning to ice. The last outgoing call wasn't to Preston. It was to Brooke Sterling. I realized in that moment that Brooke was making a move that my son didn't even know about, a separate agenda that turned the birth of my grandson into a target for a different kind of predator. I watched the gurney disappear into the bright, clinical light of the ward, the rhythmic beeping of monitors starting to echo from the hallway. I stood alone in the bay, the cold rain dripping from my coat, clutching the evidence of a betrayal that went deeper than I ever imagined. My son was a fool, but his mistress was a strategist, and she was already moving pieces on a board I hadn't fully mapped. The sterile, pressurized silence of the secure wing felt like a tomb, until a single, jagged cry ripped through the air, signaling the arrival of a life that my own son had tried to erase before it even began. I stood in the muffled silence of the waiting room, broken only by the distant rhythmic beep of a heart monitor that sounded like a countdown I was finally winning. I stood outside the delivery room door, my hand resting on the cool glass, feeling the vibration of Hannah's strength. Dr. Catherine Mills and her team worked with a frantic yet disciplined rhythm, their voices a low murmur of encouragement against the monitor's wet, mechanical thrum. I watched through the narrow pane as Hannah, pale and drenched in sweat, gave everything she had left to the world. It was the most honest, raw display of human construction I had ever witnessed, the building of a future out of pure pain and love. "One more, Hannah. Just one more for your son," Dr. Mills encouraged. "I can't. Mitchell. I can't." Hannah's voice was a ragged whisper that tore at my soul. I realized in that moment that Owen didn't resemble Preston at all. Even through the glass, I could see the infant had the exact same jagged birthmark on his shoulder, that my own father had carried a genetic middle finger to the man trying to kill us. How could a man be worth $45 million and yet feel like he was finally receiving his first real paycheck in the form of a 6-pound infant at exactly 3:17 a.m.? The room erupted into the sounds of success, not the clinking of champagne glasses after a corporate raid, but the high, indignant wail of Owen Stone. Baby Owen Stone, just minutes old, and already a fighter, lay wrapped in a hospital blanket, his dark hair a messy crown of the family's future. Dr. Mills held up the tiny, purple-hued infant, and for a moment I forgot the arsenic in my blood and the burner phone in my pocket. They cleaned him quickly and wrapped him in a soft blue blanket, the nurses moving with a reverence that told me they knew this wasn't an ordinary birth. He wasn't a Stone legacy to be managed. He was a human being to be loved. When Dr. Mills finally beckoned me inside, my legs felt like they were made of water, but as she placed him in my arms, I felt a surge of physical vitality. The symptoms of the toxin, the lethargy, the dull ache in my joints vanished, momentarily replaced by an instinctual drive that overrode the poison. "He's 6 pounds, 3 ounces of absolute defiance," Mitchell Catherine said, her eyes smiling over her mask. I looked down at the soft velvet texture of Owen's skin against my rough, calloused hands. He looks like hope," I whispered. I looked down into Owen's dark, serious eyes and whispered a promise to keep him safe, but my words were cut short by the burner phone in my pocket, vibrating. I pulled it out the screen, illuminating my face with a cold, blue light. It was a picture message showing the exact hospital entrance where we had arrived, the car Henry had parked, still visible in the frame. The chilling realization that the sanctuary had been breached snapped me back into a state of high-alert paranoia. My grandson was finally here, and his father was already at the gates. I pulled my hand back from Owen's tiny fingers, as if the phone in my pocket had turned into a live nerve, the screen glowing with a high-definition image of our town car idling in the Penn Medicine ambulance bay. The chilling realization that the sanctuary had been breached settled over me like a cold Philadelphia fog. I stood in the recovery room, watching the blue artificial glare of the smartphone screen reflected in the glass of the window. Nicole Harper quietly entered the room, her face tight with a professional mask that didn't quite hide her alarm. She handed me her own device, showing me a trending post on a local Philadelphia society blog. A concerned citizen had posted a photo of the Stone family car at the hospital, speculating about an emergency berth in the secure wing. I realized then that the concerned citizen wasn't a passerby. The angle was too perfect, taken from the security kiosk. The hospital's own night shift guard, a man I'd trusted to keep the perimeter, was clearly on Preston's payroll. "It has already had 5,000 views," Mitchell Nicole whispered, the rhythmic mocking ping of social media notifications on her phone punctuating her words. "People are asking if it is an heir. An heir. No, it is a target." I rasped my pulse, beginning to race with the familiar arsenic-fueled thrum of panic. Preston isn't just coming. He is bringing an audience. The fortress of Penn Medicine, with its reinforced doors and private access, suddenly felt as transparent as glass. How do you fight a man who uses the very life you gave him as a weapon to destroy you? I had built monuments to the Stone name across this city, but I was currently standing in a cage of my own design. The burner phone I had recovered from the Scout began to vibrate in my palm, a metallic, angry rasp that cut through the sterile silence. I stepped into the hallway away from Hannah's sleeping form and answered. It wasn't a Scout. "I hope you're enjoying your last few hours of grandfatherhood," Dad Preston's voice said, devoid of the fake filial concern he'd used during our tea visits. "That boy is my ticket back to the board. I've already filed for emergency custody. Given Hannah's disappearance and her history of instability, the court won't even hesitate." I stood under the flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner clinging to the air. "You will have to step over my body to touch that bassinet, Preston." I replied, my voice a low, lethal growl. His laugh was a jagged sound through the receiver. "Your body, Brooke, says the arsenic is just the appetizer, Mitchell. She actually has a copy of your preliminary blood work from Dr. Fisher's lab. Did you really think an old friend was more loyal than a new paycheck?" My blood turned to ice. Brooke had successfully infiltrated Fisher's lab, or intercepted the communication, and now they held the map to my physical decline. The hospital walls didn't smell like medicine anymore. They smelled like a trap. I realized then that the custody threat was only the first move in a much darker game. "By the way, Dad," Brooke says to tell Owen goodbye, "you're already a ghost." Remember, he hung up, leaving me in the echoing silence of the corridor. I stared at the phone, the mathematics of the audit, and the clinical reality of the poison finally merging into a single desperate mission. I wasn't just fighting for my company anymore. I was fighting for the very air Owen was breathing. The receiver clicked into place like the latch of a cage. Preston's threats still echoing in the sterile hallway as I turned my back on his darkness and looked toward the cold, undeniable light of the audit. I retreated to my study, the silence of the house now feeling like a fortress rather than a home. Before the final meeting, I had already executed a silent counterstrike. I secretly transferred 49% of my personal shares into an irrevocable trust for baby Owen. Even if Preston managed to claw his way to the top of Stone Enterprises, he would be eternally blocked by the inheritance of the very son he viewed as a mere bargaining chip. I sat at my desk, the blue hypnotic glow of the spreadsheet on the screen illuminating the wreckage of my trust. Rebecca Sinclair arrived shortly after carrying the final bound reports, with an expression as grim as a tombstone. She laid out the digital map of the $753,000 theft, proving the money had been funneled into a Caribbean offshore fund tied directly to Brooke's biometric signature. I looked at the signatures Preston had forged, recognizing how he had used my own past contracts as a template for his betrayal. Every cent he stole was a brick pulled from the foundation of the house I built for him, and now I had the evidence to bring the whole structure down on his head. It is all here. Mitchell Rebecca said, her voice a sharp blade in the quiet room. The trail doesn't just lead to his door. It leads to his fingerprints. Good, I replied, staring at the smell of heavy ink and high-grade printer paper. I want him to see the exact moment the money he killed for vanishes. Is it still murder if the person you're killing is the memory of who you thought your son was? I felt a calculating dominance over the situation, a death of paternal mercy that left me cold and precise. I began the final phase of setting the trap. I composed a short clinical text message to Preston, inviting him to the presidential suite at the Regency to discuss a final settlement for Owen's future. I knew his greed would outweigh his caution. The lure of a corporate surrender would be too much for him to resist. I coordinated with Mark Sullivan and Detective Ramirez, ensuring the suite was wired for sound and the arrest team was positioned in the adjoining room. I looked at the medical file on my desk, the toxicology report that proved he was a murderer, and I felt a cold, terrifying peace settle over me. Regency Hotel, Suite 4001. Tomorrow at noon. Bring Brooke, I typed. The trap was set. The bait was the one thing he loved more than life, my money. He'll come, Mitchell Rebecca whispered as she prepared to leave. Men like him always show up to claim their prize. But as she reached the door, she paused, handing me one last document she had uncovered. My heart gave a sickening lurch as I read it. Brooke had already tried to cash out my $10 million life insurance policy using a forged notice of terminal illness signed by a doctor she had bribed. They weren't just waiting for the arsenic to work. They were already spending the payout. My thumb hovered over the send button, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure distilled justice as I sent the invitation to the reckoning my son never saw coming. The cold, mechanical vibration of the phone after the message was sent was the only sound in the room. The scent of high-end furniture polish and expensive lilies in the Regency suite was a lie, a mask for the clinical trap I had spent the last 72 hours engineering with the precision of a skyscraper's foundation. I stood alone in the center of the room, my thumb still tracing the edge of the phone where I had sent that final invitation to my own reckoning. The lilies were more than a decoration. I had chosen them because their cloying, sweet scent triggers a minor allergic reaction. In Brooke, a calculated irritation designed to keep her off balance. I did a final sweep of the suite, ensuring the pinhole cameras and directional microphones Mark Sullivan installed were active. I took my place behind the massive, cool mahogany desk, intentionally leaving my hand in the light so they could see the subtle, practiced tremor I was using to play the part of a dying man. Detective Ramirez was positioned in the adjoining bedroom, a silent ghost waiting for the signal that would end my son's freedom. "Is the feed live?" Mark I whispered into my collar. Loud and clear. Mitchell, the response, crackled back. The moment they step through those doors, they're on the record. The sharp, rhythmic ticking of a hidden clock felt like the countdown to a controlled demolition. How do you welcome your own murderers to lunch, I suppose, with a smile and a 30-year-old scotch they'll never get to taste? I sat in the heavy silence of the 40th floor, the air pressure feeling as though it were changing right before a blast. The heavy mahogany doors swung open at exactly noon, and Preston walked in with Brooke on his arm, both of them radiating a nauseating aura of triumph. Preston looked better than I'd seen him in weeks. His stride arrogant, likely fueled by the belief that he was minutes away from signing my legacy over to himself. I didn't rise to greet them. I simply gestured toward the velvet chairs, watching Brooke's eyes scan the room for any sign of Hannah. Her nose crinkled at the scent of the lilies, a tiny victory that I noted with clinical satisfaction. "You look remarkably alive today," Dad Preston said, his voice dripping with that fake filial concern that used to fool me. "Let's get these papers signed so you can finally rest. You've done enough." "I'm afraid the only thing resting today, Preston, is your delusion of inheritance." I replied, my voice a dry, steady rasp. I reached into the drawer and pulled out a medical file. The report didn't just list the arsenic. It listed the intent. I slid the toxicology report across the heavy desk, the dry, papery sound echoing in the room like a final lethal card in a game they didn't know they were losing. Brooke's hand darted forward, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to snatch the document away to hide the bolded conclusion from Dr. Fisher. I caught her wrist with a sudden iron-like strength that proved my failing health was a total fabrication. I watched the blood drain from her face as she read the words, "Lethal intent confirmed by systematic dosage." Preston stared at us, his mouth falling open as the realization hit him that I wasn't the ghost he had been feeding. I looked into the eyes of the boy I had raised, seeing only a predator who had finally been snared in his own trap. I didn't blink as Preston's fake concern dissolved into the shrill, desperate laughter of a man who realized the ground he was standing on had already been rigged to collapse. "You think you're so smart, Mitchell." He spat, the nervous chuckle dying in his throat. "You're a dying old man. No court will believe the delusions of a senile lunatic." I silenced his stuttering excuses by slamming the heavy binder of the forensic audit onto the desk. The sound was like a gavel striking a final judgment. I began walking him through the $753,000 trail, pointing out the exact moments he used my dizzy spells to forge my signature on wire transfers. I watched as the reality set in. This wasn't just a family spat. He was staring at a federal paper trail I had personally financed. The arrogance in his posture withered, and for a moment I saw the sharp, acrid smell of his sweat fill the small space between us. He looked like a cornered animal, a total stranger to me. "Every dollar has a heartbeat, Preston," I said, my voice as cold as the marble in a mausoleum. "And yours just stopped. Is there a specific circle of hell for a man who tries to trade his newborn son's safety for a get-out-of-jail-free card?" I asked myself as he leaned forward, his eyes darting toward the adjoining room. He demanded to know where Owen was claiming his right as the biological father to take the child immediately. He told me he'd burn the reports if I restored his trust fund, suggesting Owen would grow up in poverty if I sent his father to prison. It was a coward's bargain. I revealed then that Owen's legal birth certificate lists the father as unknown. Hannah filed an emergency protection affidavit while she was still at Penn Medicine, stripping his immediate parental rights. "You want Owen?" I asked, my construction-built frame finally towering over him. "You don't even know the color of his eyes, Preston. You only know the weight of his inheritance." The bargain was dead. The son was gone. Only the evidence remained. "Give me the boy and the company." Preston roared, his face contorting into something demonic, "or I'll make sure Hannah is in a psych ward by dinner." My disgust reached its peak. The heavy, rhythmic thud of my heart against my ribs was the only sound in the room until Preston made his move. He lunged toward the bedroom door, thinking the baby was sleeping behind it. I didn't stop him. I let him grab the handle. Preston's hand froze on the bedroom door handle as the click of 3 service weapons being unholstered echoed through the suite's silence. Detective Ramirez, a 40-year-old veteran, with a face that looked like it was carved from Philadelphia granite, stepped out of the shadows with his badge held high. 2 uniformed officers followed their expressions, as grim as the situation demanded. Brooke's eyes darted toward the balcony exit, but the trap was already airtight. Preston turned, his face drained of color, as he looked from the barrels of the pistols to the man he had tried to murder. The bargain was over. Mitchell Stone watched as the son he had built a world for finally faced the consequences of trying to tear it down. The click of the handcuffs was the last sound I needed to hear. The transition from predatory silence to the deafening roar of authority was instantaneous. The air in the suite fracturing as Detective Ramirez's voice boomed over the frantic thrum of my own pulse. Preston's hand remained frozen on the door handle, a statue of caught guilt, as the clinical trap I had laid finally snapped shut. He tried to scramble backward, his eyes darting toward the window, but the uniformed officers swarmed the room with a practiced, lethal efficiency. He began to scream a shrill, hysterical sound, claiming I was the one who had poisoned him during our last tea visit. It was a desperate gamble, but Detective Ramirez didn't even blink. The tea was swapped for a non-toxic sedative by Mark Sullivan hours before you ever touched that cup. Preston the detective said, his voice cold. We have the swap on camera. Officers forced my son to his knees on the plush Regency carpet, the blue and red flicker of police lights from the street reflecting against the gold leaf ceiling. I watched unmoved as the arrogance he'd worn like a bespoke suit was stripped away by the cold, biting sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut. 35 years of fatherhood ended with the click of a ratchet. He began to babble, his loyalty dissolving as quickly as his inheritance. It was her idea Brooke brought the powders, Mitchell. I was just protecting the company. Quiet, Preston, I said, my voice a dispassionate rasp. Every word you speak only adds another year to your sentence. I looked out at the Philadelphia skyline I had helped build and wondered how I could have ever seen a successor in this broken shell of a man. In the chaotic humiliation of the arrest, I realized the room was suddenly lighter. Brooke Sterling had exploited the moment the officers tackled Preston to slip through the side service entrance. I looked around, my heart giving a sickening lurch as I realized the lingering, suffocating scent of her floral perfume was the only thing she had left behind. I signaled to Mark Sullivan, but the hallway was already empty. Brooke was like smoke, impossible to hold and poisonous to breathe. She hadn't stayed to fight or defend her lover. She had calculated the odds and chosen flight the second the first badge was shown. She's gone, Sir Mark said, his face illuminated by the static-filled rasp of his security radio. She used a service elevator override we didn't account for. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, a sudden cold alarm replacing my victory. I reached for the manila envelope she'd discarded on the table, and my fingers caught on something hard. I tore at the lining, revealing a small, blinking GPS tracker. She didn't intend to run. She intended to follow me to the one thing I had left to lose. I realized then that Preston's arrest wasn't the end of the game. It was Brooke's diversion. Mark Sullivan's radio crackled with a sound that made the arsenic in my blood feel warm by comparison. Sir, a black sedan just broke the perimeter at the Rittenhouse Villa. Brooke isn't running to the airport, she's going for the baby. My relief died in my throat, replaced by a panic-stricken but lethally purposeful clarity. I didn't wait for the officers to lead Preston out. I was already moving toward the door, the ghost of my fatigue forgotten as I raced to protect the future from the woman who had already destroyed my past. The screech of tires as I threw myself into the back seat of the town car was still echoing in my mind, my heart a hammer against the fragile architecture of my ribs. But the sirens had long since faded into the Philadelphia night, leaving only the sound of my own rhythmic breathing and the heavy, metallic realization that the war for my bloodline was finally over. I stood in the damp entryway of the Rittenhouse Villa as Brooke Sterling was led away in steel restraints. Her cloying floral perfume was now tainted by the smell of damp stone ozone and wet pavement. I realized then that she hadn't actually broken the perimeter by skill. I had instructed Henry to leave the back gate unlatched to lure her into a preset police net. I needed her caught in the act of attempted kidnapping, not just financial fraud, to ensure she would never see the light of day again. She didn't look like a master strategist anymore. She looked like a cornered animal realizing the cage was reinforced with the very steel she thought she could bend. I watched the police cruiser pull away, the red and blue lights reflecting off the nursery window, where baby Owen slept undisturbed by the violence that had just tried to claim him. The threat was no longer a shadow in the hallway, but a booking number in the system. "It is over, Brooke," I murmured as they pushed her into the car. "You underestimated the foundation. This city belongs to the Stones, Mitchell. She spat back, her eyes wild. We were just the current residents. I watched her go with a cold, absolute closure, feeling a physical weight lifting from my chest. Do you know what silence sounds like when you've spent months waiting for the sound of your own heart to stop? It is a heavy, deafening peace that makes the marrow in your bones feel solid again. I sat in the library of the villa, the smell of damp stone and morning dew drifting through the cracked window. The tremors in my hands had subsided to a faint hum, and the gray pallor of my skin was finally yielding to a flush of real life as the detox protocol took hold. I watched the sun begin to crest over the Rittenhouse Square skyline, the warmth of the first sunlight hitting my face. I realized that I didn't just build these towers, I survived them. I was no longer listening for a poisoner's footstep. I was listening to the rhythmic, soft breathing of the baby from the monitor. Hannah Vance appeared briefly at the door, her face still pale but her eyes clear. "You should sleep, Mitchell," she said softly. "You look like you're finally back." "I will," I replied. "I just want to watch the city wake up, without me needing to fix it for a moment." The tea was just tea. The air was just air. I was just Mitchell. The absence of the metallic taste in my mouth was the sweetest victory I had ever tasted. I reached for a book on the side table but found a final letter from Brooke instead. It wasn't a threat, but a list of other board members she had been consulting for detailing secret offshore agreements. I closed Brooke's letter and looked at the names of my colleagues, realizing that the healing of my body was just the preparation for the purge of my boardroom. The rot in Stone Enterprises went far deeper than my son. The glass doors of Stone Enterprises didn't hiss open for me anymore. They felt like the gates of a temple I had allowed to be desecrated, and I was back to perform the exorcism. The polished granite lobby looked the same as always, but it felt like a battlefield I was finally ready to clean. I had used the embezzled funds recovered from Brooke's offshore accounts to create a permanent legal defense fund for any employee ever wrongly accused by the firm, a foundation of justice to replace the one built on greed. I convened an emergency boardroom meeting at exactly 10 a.m. I didn't seek consensus. I delivered a verdict. I laid out the evidence Brooke's final letter had provided, watching the faces of 3 senior directors turn the color of ash as I detailed their secret consultation fees and offshore agreements. "You didn't just bet against my life," I told them, my voice a cold, clinical blade. "You bet against the integrity of this firm. Consider your resignations a mercy I didn't show my own son." By noon, the rot had been surgically removed, leaving only the clean, honest stone behind. Can you ever truly wash the blood off a balance sheet? Or do you just keep adding enough good to outweigh the bad? I stood in the lobby at 2 p.m., the smell of floor wax and expensive cologne, a sharp reminder of the world I had built. Leo Grant, a 30-year-old father of 2, with the tired eyes of a man who had spent months defending a ghost of a reputation, walked in clutching his briefcase like a shield. Marcus Thorne, younger and more brittle than Leo, looked around the lobby as if he expected the walls to collapse on him at any moment. I stepped forward, the echoing sound of my heels on marble the only noise in the atrium. I handed them each a cool, heavy settlement envelope and a senior management contract. "I didn't just bring you back for your skills, Leo," I said, looking into his eyes. "I brought you back for your honor." Looking into their eyes, I saw the exact moment their dignity was restored, a construction project far more important than any skyscraper I had ever designed. 30 years to build. 1 morning to clean. My real legacy wasn't the buildings, but the people I had failed and then fought to save. Later that day, I attended Preston's sentencing hearing. The blinding, honest sunlight through the courtroom glass felt like a physical weight. Preston attempted to blame my parenting for his crimes, but the judge revealed that I had actually set up a secret scholarship fund in his name decades ago, a fund he had been siphoning from since his college days. As the bailiff led him away to begin his 15-year sentence, he stopped and looked at me. his eyes filled with a terrifyingly clear recognition. "You're still a stone dad," he hissed, his voice a ragged shadow of the one that used to laugh at my dinner table. "You just traded a son for a stranger's baby." I didn't answer. I simply watched him go, the last link to a version of myself I no longer recognized. I walked out into the Philadelphia afternoon, the air smelling of rain and asphalt, feeling the weight of the company and the weight of the future finally coming into balance. The war was over, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one holding the line. I was the one letting it move forward. The morning sun didn't just illuminate my office. It felt like a spotlight on a stage where the actors had finally changed, replacing a hollow villain with the woman who had saved the foundation of my life. I stood in the quiet of the Rittenhouse Villa at sunset, a place that no longer felt like a bunker, but a true sanctuary. Before we returned to the corporate glass towers, I handed Hannah a document that would ensure her place in my world was immutable. "I have officially adopted you as my legal daughter, Hannah," I said, watching her eyes widen as she read the filing. "You are a stone by law now, with full voting power on the board that no one can ever challenge." I led her into the executive suite that used to belong to the CFO, now reorganized as the Department of Internal Audit and Ethics. I handed her the master digital key, the weight of the metal, a symbol of the trust I was placing in her hands. "This isn't just a job, Hannah," I told her, my voice a gravely rumble of pride. "You are the heartbeat of this company's conscience now." She sat behind the desk, with a confidence forged in the fire of her survival, the smell of fresh ink on high-quality paper filling the room. "I won't let them down, Mitchell," she promised. "I know exactly where the shadows like to hide." Leadership isn't about the height of the tower. It is about the depth of the roots. I spent the hour reviewing the transparency protocols she had designed, realized that she was the true successor I had been searching for all along. Later that evening, I stood on the balcony of the Rittenhouse Villa, the cool spring breeze off the square, ruffling my hair. I was holding baby Owen, his weight a solid, comforting presence against my chest. The city lights below twinkled like a sea of diamonds, a landscape I had spent 40 years shaping. But I now viewed it with the perspective of a man who finally knew what mattered. I looked down at the boy in my arms, seeing the birthmark on his shoulder, the mark of my father, and felt a profound sense of legacy fulfillment. The poison was gone. The stone remained. Hannah joined me, the warm glow of the sunset, hitting the glass towers in the distance. "He looks just like you when you are thinking about a new project," she said, leaning her head against my shoulder. The soft, rhythmic cooing of Owen was the only sound in the peaceful twilight. "He is my greatest project, Hannah," I replied, "and I am just getting started." I reached into my pocket and handed her one final document, the deed to the Rittenhouse Villa in her and Owen's names. "I intend to spend my remaining years traveling and consulting." I explained, feeling a serenity I hadn't known since I was a young man. "I am leaving the foundation to you." I turned away from the skyline and looked into Owen's dark, serious eyes. I knew that while I was the architect of the past, he was the blueprint for a future where the stone name finally meant something good. The war was over, the rot was purged, and for the first time I could look at the horizon without wondering what was being stirred into my tea. I was Mitchell Stone, and I had finally built something that would last. I adjusted my cufflinks in the mirror, the silver catching the light, as I realized that for the first time in years, the man looking back at me wasn't haunted by the shadows of his own boardroom. The cold, heavy weight of the cufflinks against my wrists served as a grounded reminder of the physical strength I had clawed back from the brink of arsenic-induced decay. The grand ballroom of the Bellevue was a sea of expensive perfume and floor wax, an arena of light where the orchestra played a rhythmic, echoing waltz that masked the true nature of my presence here. Tonight wasn't about construction contracts or the skyline I had built. It was about the launch of the Stone Foundation for Ethics in Business. I stood beside Hannah, who looked radiant and formidable in her role as the foundation's primary trustee, her presence a living testament to the survival of the Stone name. We moved through the crowd, accepting the performative apologies of board members who had once looked the other way. But my focus remained on the encrypted tablet tucked into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket. The gala itself was a carefully engineered distraction. The high-profile nature of the event forced the international bank holding our offshore funds to remain open and active for VIP verification, a small but critical opening for the final financial cleansing. I lead a quiet life now, but I haven't forgotten how to dismantle a structure. "You've done it," Mitchell Hanna whispered, as we paused near the champagne fountain. "You've turned the scandal into a sanctuary." "I didn't do it alone, Hannah," I replied, my voice a gravely rumble. "And we aren't finished until the last penny is back where it belongs." "Is it still a heist if you're taking back what was always yours?" "The law says yes, but the blood in my veins says it's just home building." I stepped into a quiet alcove, the blue, hypnotic glow of the tablet screen illuminating the sharp lines of my face in the shadows. I activated the bypass Rebecca Sinclair had engineered, tracking the rerouting of $12 million from a dormant account in the Cayman Islands back into the Foundation's endowment. 12 million. Every cent was a drop of sweat from a laborer's brow, stolen by a son who saw them as numbers on a ledger. I watched the progress bar crawl toward completion, my heart steady and sure. As the transfer complete notification flashed, I felt the final knot of tension in my chest unravel, replaced by a surge of vitality that the poison had once tried to steal. "Checkmate, Brooke," I muttered to the empty alcove. "Wherever you are." But as I reviewed the final logs of the transfer, my eyebrows pulled together in a sharp, investigative frown. I discovered that a significant portion of the recovered millions hadn't just been siphoned from Stone Enterprises. It had been funneled into Brooke's accounts by an unknown benefactor, a separate stream of capital that predated Preston's involvement. This wasn't just a family betrayal, it was a corporate hit. I tucked the tablet away and looked back at the crowd, my eyes scanning the socialites and the power brokers. My eyes landed on a familiar face at the back of the room, someone who shouldn't have been able to afford a ticket to this event, let alone be standing in the inner circle of my colleagues. The hunt wasn't over. It had just found a new architect. The sound of my polished shoes clicking on the marble floor echoed as I moved toward the shadows at the edge of the ballroom. I moved through the sea of silk and tuxedos, my hand hovering near the pocket where the recovered millions sat in digital safety. But my eyes remained locked on the man in the threadbare charcoal suit, who looked entirely out of place. I didn't just find them by accident. I had secretly dispatched a private jet to the mountains of West Virginia days ago to ensure they arrived in time for the Foundation's launch. I reached the back of the ballroom and realized the suspicious guest wasn't a corporate spy or one of Brooke's associates, but a man whose weathered face mirrored Hannah's own features. Silas Vance, a man with hands like cracked leather and a suit that smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke, stood tall despite the weight of the city pressing down on him. Beside him stood Martha Vance, a small bird-like woman whose eyes possessed a sharpness that suggested she had spent a lifetime looking for truth in the dark. "We aren't here to cause trouble, sir." Silas said, his voice a low rumble of mountain thunder. "We just heard on the news. We thought we saw our Hannah." "You aren't trouble, Silas?" I replied, my voice softening as I reached out to touch his scratchy, work-hardened hand. "You're exactly what this family is missing. Why do we spend millions on art and architecture when the most beautiful structure is a father finally holding his daughter again?" I guided Silas and Martha through the crowd, ignoring the whispers of the elite, as I led these simple, honest people toward the center of the room, where the orchestra was playing a slow, rhythmic ballad. When Hannah saw them, she froze, the high society mask she'd worn all night shattering instantly. The champagne glass in her hand trembled, the liquid blurring with the lights through her sudden tears. Mom, Dad. How? How did you get here? She whispered, her voice breaking. Mr. Stone sent for us, honey. Martha said, her voice trembling with a visceral relief. He said you were a hero. The diamonds in the room were fake compared to the raw tears on Martha's face. The reunion was visceral, a collision of West Virginia coal dust and Philadelphia marble. I watched as they embraced, realizing that my greatest achievement wasn't the construction of the foundation, but the demolition of the walls that kept this girl from her home. I sat back and watched the healing, the first real foundation I had ever built that wouldn't ever crumble. But as the crowd began to drift away, Silas pulled me aside, his expression darkening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled check, one my son had written, that never cleared. He told us if we didn't sign a paper saying Hannah was unstable and a habitual runaway, we'd never see her alive again. Silas whispered, his eyes filled with a weary, ancient pain. He tried to buy our silence, Mitchell. He tried to buy our daughter's life. I took the paper, the cold reality of Preston's depravity hitting me one final time. Even at the end, I was still finding the shards of the glass he had broken. The golden Philadelphia sunlight filtered through the ancient oaks, casting long, peaceful shadows that made the frantic, arsenic-laced nightmare of the last year feel like a story told about a man I no longer recognized. I sat on a sun-baked park bench in Rittenhouse Square, my hands steady and warm in the September heat. I watched Hannah walk Owen in his stroller, the Vance parents trailing behind them, with a look of quiet wonder at the city they once feared. There were no bodyguards in sight, only the invisible shield of the peace I had spent my fortune to build. I had officially dissolved Stone Enterprises as a public entity weeks ago, taking it private so that the family never again has to answer to a board of directors that values profit over people. The corporate machine was dead. The family legacy had finally begun to live. Silas Vance sat beside me, the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke clinging to his coat. You look like a man who has finally retired from the war, Mitchell. He said, his voice a low rumble of mountain thunder. I didn't retire, Silas. I replied, my voice a gravely rumble of contentment. I just finally won the only territory that mattered. The air didn't taste like hospital bleach or bitter tea anymore. It tasted like the beginning of something that wouldn't be built of glass and steel, but of blood and time. I used to think a legacy was a skyscraper. I was wrong. It is a small hand that won't let go of yours in the sun. Hannah brought Owen over to the bench, the faint scent of her simple soap drifting in the spring breeze. She lifted him from the stroller and placed his small, warm weight into my lap. As I looked down at his dark, curious eyes, he reached out a tiny, uncoordinated hand and gripped my index finger with a strength that caught me off guard. He has got your stubbornness, you know, Hannah said with a soft laugh. He won't let go. Good, I whispered, feeling a profound physical and emotional anchor in that small, fierce grip. A stone should know when he is holding on to something worth keeping. In that moment, I felt the final traces of the poison leave my soul, replaced by a legacy that didn't require a boardroom to validate. He squeezed. I breathed. We began. I looked down at his tiny wrist and froze. There, hidden in the folds of his skin, was a faint birthmark in the exact shape of a cornerstone, a final miraculous sign that this child was the true foundation of the new Stone legacy. It was a genetic seal of approval from the generations that came before me, a mark that bypassed the rot of my son and linked me directly to the future. I looked up at the Philadelphia skyline I had built, the glass towers shimmering in the distance like diamonds. Then I looked back down at the boy in my arms, realizing that while I had spent my life building for the city, I was finally spending my days building for the soul. The distant, happy murmur of the city on a Sunday afternoon was the only soundtrack I needed. I closed my eyes, the warmth of the sun and the weight of my grandson finally balancing the scales of a life I had almost lost. I was Mitchell Stone, and for the first time I was home. The city lights began to pulse like a slow, electric heart beneath me. But my focus remained on the ink drying on the page, the final blueprint of a man who had survived his own collapse. I stood alone on the balcony of the Rittenhouse Villa at twilight, the cool evening air of Philadelphia carrying the distant low hum of city traffic. I looked out at the skyline I had helped build, then back down at the leather-bound book in my lap, realizing that while I had spent my life building for the city, I was finally spending my days building for the soul. This journal was more than a collection of memories. I had embedded within its technical appendices the private keys to a blockchain trust. It was my final safeguard the funds would only release for Owen if Hannah's ethics department at the private firm approved his character at age 25. I sat at the small iron table, the smell of old leather and fresh ink rising to meet me as the pen felt light in my hand. I was no longer a man signing termination papers or authorizing hostile takeovers. I was a grandfather leaving a map through the dark. To my grandson, never trust a structure that doesn't account for the soul, I wrote, my hand steady despite the physical weariness that came with age. The greatest thing I ever built was the bridge back to this family. I detailed the history of the Stone name, ensuring he would know that while we built the skyline, we also learned to mend the spirits we broke along the way. I wanted him to understand that a true legacy isn't measured in stories of steel, but in the silence of a clear conscience. I wrote about the arsenic not as a tragedy, but as a teacher that showed me the fragility of a foundation built only on profit. The ink was dry. The debt was paid. The stone was set. I paused, looking up at the horizon as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to look at my watch or check a stock ticker. The frantic race for more height, more power, more time had finally reached its end. I was finally existing outside of time, a man whose work was finished and whose peace was absolute. The city lights continued their rhythmic pulse, but they were no longer my masters. They were simply a view. I felt a profound sense of closure, the kind that only comes when you know the next generation is standing on solid ground. As I prepared to go inside, I realized that my survival wasn't just a medical miracle, but a spiritual necessity. I had to live long enough to ensure the poison stopped with me. I reached the end of the final page, the heavy weight of the journey behind me, transforming into a buoyant lightness. I realized that my own story was just the preamble to Owen's. I stood up, my joints stiff, but my spirit unburdened. The tactile snap of the journal's clasp echoed in the quiet evening air, a sound of finality that rang truer than any boardroom gavel. I snapped the journal shut and looked toward the nursery, where a single light burned a beacon for the boy who would never have to taste the arsenic of my past. I walked toward the door, leaving the skyline to the night and my legacy to the light. Looking back at my family story, I realize I spent decades building an empire, but failed to build a relationship with my own son. Don't be like me. Don't measure your worth by the height of your towers while ignoring the cracks in your foundation. I was so focused on constructing a legacy that I didn't see the monster I was raising under my own roof. This dad revenge wasn't born from hatred. It was born from survival and the desperate need to protect an innocent child. But here's the truth. Revenge shouldn't have been necessary. If I had been present, truly present in Preston's life, maybe he wouldn't have become the man who tried to kill me. I built him a kingdom, but forgot to teach him character. The greatest lesson from this family story is simple: watch who you trust. But more importantly, be someone worth trusting. I ignored Hannah's suffering, dismissed the warning signs, and nearly paid with my life. Your closest circle can become your greatest threat if you prioritize profit over people. My dad revenge taught me that justice without mercy is hollow. Yes, I stopped Preston, but I lost a son in the process. That's a wound no amount of money can heal. I believe the Lord's timing was perfect. He allowed me to see the truth before it destroyed everything. God doesn't just save us from our enemies. Sometimes He saves us from ourselves. To anyone listening, don't wait for the arsenic to reach your bloodstream before you examine your family story. Protect your peace, verify your trust, and remember that blood relations mean nothing without loyalty and love. This dad revenge saved my grandson Owen, but I survived carrying scars that will never fully heal. The tallest building is worthless if it's built on a foundation of lies. Thank you for walking with me through this entire journey. I want to hear from you. Please leave a comment sharing your perspective. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation where your own family betrayed you? Like this, would you choose revenge, forgiveness, or something in between? Your viewpoint truly matters to me. If this story resonated with you emotionally or made you reflect on your own relationships, please consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss future stories that explore the complex dynamics of trust, betrayal, and redemption. A gentle reminder: while inspired by real-world themes of family conflict and corporate corruption, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes to create a compelling narrative arc. If this style of content doesn't align with your preferences, feel free to explore other videos that might be a better fit for you.